Hi, everyone, and welcome to Legal Management Talk, where we're covering every angle of legal management. I'm your host, Justin Askenazy. Today, we're talking about an important topic within the context of today's kind of, law firm strategic objectives and trends, and that is lateral hiring, and kind of discussing the past year of lateral hiring and what's coming in the future. So with us today are Greg Hamman and Julie Henson. They are the Chief Data Officer and Chief Growth Officer, respectively, of Decipher Intel, which helps law firms with growth and risk management through investigative intelligence. So first of all, thank you for being here, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Let's jump right in. And I understand that you're in the process of putting together a report on laterals in 2024. And so I wanted to kind of discuss some of the trends you found, the data you found for, to kind of wrap up what 2024 meant in terms of lateral hiring trends.
Sure, and I'll start off with some of the insights that we've gathered throughout by analyzing some of the 2024 data. Over the last 2 years, we've really seen a bifurcation in mobility rates among partners, between partners and associates. So we've seen associate moves continue to decrease, hiring continue to decrease at the associate level. A lot of firms are rebalancing headcount. They scaled up right after the pandemic with a lot of associates in different practice areas because they needed the work done. And now, since demand is somewhat decreasing, they're starting to rebalance headcount, and they're starting to understand that they can gain more efficiencies back by having less people on staff. They're trying to be lean, they're trying to be efficient, and that's really the cause of the associate mobility decrease that we witnessed. On the other hand, partner moves are continuing to increase. We've observed through quarter three, at least, about a 10% increase compared to 2023 in partner mobility in 2024. So, once we get that Q4 data in and kind of analyze that, we'll have full year data. But it seems that law firms are really using partner hires to drive growth. Obviously client acquisition is the key to driving revenue. And the easiest way to do that is through partner acquisition. And firms, especially in the MLO 100, have understood that since, about 2021 and probably even further, and have stepped on the gas when it comes to hiring partners that way. I think the other point, before I pitch it over to Julie, is, we need to view mobility data with a little bit of caution and a little bit of context. Part of why I think it's important to analyze moves or annual moves against previous years, multiple years, is because we've seen just historic mobility after the pandemic in 2021 and 2022. So when you look at moves in a vacuum compared to those 2 years, it's going to look like a bloodbath. And in the reality of the situation is a lot of firms are still having a very robust hiring scheme. It's just compared to those historic years, it looks smaller. So what we've done is take a more holistic approach and compare that to a previous 7-year average going back to 2017 and 2016 so that you can see what moves look like, through those ups and downs.
Yeah, and I would say one of the big things that we work with clients on, and particularly in 2024, is that as they're bringing on these new partners and vetting them, they're really wanting to understand what their true book of business looks like. I think before, a lot of firms would take their potential partners' word on their LPQ. And what we've been able to do is really go in to see whether or not what they're proclaiming in other LPQ is accurate. Because firms, I think, has been finding in 2023 and 2024 that they've gotten burned by bringing on partners that don't have the book of business that they say they do. So I think firms are being a lot more thoughtful in how they approach a lateral and then how they evaluate them as well.
That's interesting that firms are finding that that the lawyers aren't totally bringing what they say they're going to bring. Why is that? And how do firms, do even better due diligence to try to, figure that out?
I mean, I think from my perspective, and Greg, I'd love to hear yours, is that when a lawyer is on the market or wanting to leave their firm, they get really excited and you know, they might not do it intentionally, but they really feel like they could bring that book of business over with them if they try hard enough. And when you put that information in your LPQ, that's a direct correlation to what your compensation could be. And so they're incentivized to put more book of business down because they know that then they'll get paid more at that firm. So that's kind of where I think the numbers get inflated. And it's up to the law firm to be able to vet that to make sure that that is real or not. Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, we've measured book of business inflation for quite a while. We started during the pandemic, and what we found was that candidates during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic were claiming twice the amount of portable business than candidates prior to the pandemic. And a couple of the reasons, were potentially, rainmakers and game changers were moving, right? So people with the business were flooding the market a little bit. Or, and more likely, there was a lot of embellishment going on. Obviously a lot of lawyers have to pitch for work once they onboarded a new firm. And it sometimes can be a crapshoot whether or not the client is going to bring all or some of that business over. And so, what we've tried to do with our clients is through a lot of data modeling and a lot of investigative intelligence, give them an extra level of security when it comes to knowing whether or not the lateral partner has the requisite relationships that they're claiming, and to the extent that they can bring over the requisite business that they're implying on their onboarding documents. So yeah, it's definitely something that has been, a crawl on the side of many law firm financial professionals for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Certainly an extra challenge to add to what is, I think, already usually a complicated hiring process. And so I want to go back to something you said initially, Greg, which is that firms are still, having a pretty robust hiring trend, even though compared to, kind of the post-pandemic early years, that it seems like it's come down a bit. But I think we hear a lot about it's a tight job market now. But it sounds to me like it's a tighter job market, just when you're comparing it to the, amazing levels that were there with the Great Resignation, everything that happened in 2021. So is that trend going to continue into 2025, or are we going to see that change over the course of the year?
No, that's a great question. And the answer is absolutely. I don't want to give the wrong impression. I partner moves have not fallen off a cliff at all, compared to 2021 and 2022. There's been a slight dip, but firms are still hiring at relatively that level. It's the associate moves that have fallen off a cliff. And that is definitely going to continue. And the reason why is because hiring partners or, lateral partners is the most efficient and most scalable way to continue revenue growth. And, when you look at mechanisms that law firms have at their disposal to increase revenue, namely, rate increases, cost cutting, and, increasing realization rates, all of those are relatively limited. We've been in an environment lately where law firms have been able to raise rates at pretty crazy amounts, 9, 10, 11, 12% year to year. And that environment likely will not continue, especially with, clients really clamoring for alternative fee arrangements and flat fee arrangements. I think that, these rate increases are going to come to an end. And so same thing with the realization, you can squeeze a couple of extra percentage points here and there for realization rates, but it's not going to be a seismic shift when it comes to revenue increases. And the same is true for cost cutting. There's limits to what you can cut, where you can cut costs. And so really that leaves lateral hiring is the only viable way to efficiently grow the entire revenue pie. and increase the profitability of the firm. And really, in our experience, and I'm sure Julie will have a lot of commentary on this, but law firms are hiring as much as their internal capacity, internal hiring mechanisms can take. If they want to hire 50 people and they have the infrastructure set up internally to onboard 50 people, they will hire 50 people. And so really, one of the things that we've tried to do is help law firms streamline the operational component and the talent identification component of lateral hiring so that they can onboard and scale up their hiring operations.
And another thing that we have found is that while firms is always going to look at attorneys that might be a great fit for their firm, but what we're finding is that firms are being more proactive when it comes to wanting to hire teams and do lift outs. And so going back to what Greg said about how the bifurcation between partners and associates, I feel like a lot of firms, when they bring on 3 or 4 new partners, they're assuming they're bringing a team with them. And so they're going to be able to get the associates that they need through that transaction. And another obvious big trend that we are continuing to see in 2025 and anticipate to uptick is firms that are trying to figure out what does their growth strategy look like when it comes to a combination or if they want to merge. When firms are starting to explore what new markets they want to go into, I think in the past they've got into the market and decided to connect with one attorney or 2 attorneys. Now they're wanting to look at what firms are in that market that they could potentially acquire. So I think that trend will also continue to increase. But going back to what Greg was saying about process is that the biggest thing that we have found and that we get feedback from clients is that the process that they have is very old school. And so they were processes that were brought up 10, 20 years ago sometimes, and the amount of attorney time that it requires to bring on a candidate is kind of out of control. When you actually look at how many hours a lawyer spends on bringing a potential partner on, the amount of cost that the firm is putting into that process is off the charts. And so we work very closely with firms with how to streamline their processes to make sure that they're getting the most accurate and aggressive background checks and due diligence without having to waste that partner's time.
And Julie, kind of piggybacking off that too, consistency is important as well. One of the things we've seen with clients, Justin, is that, they're inconsistent across practice areas and locations. Some of these firms have, 20, 25 offices in the United States and globally, and the hiring process is different for each office or each practice area or each industry group. And so what we've really tried to do is push very consistent processes, whether it's, interviewing and evaluation, or as Julie mentioned, due diligence process on each one of these candidates or targets, so that you're actually getting an apples to apples comparison so that you can hire people according to your strategy. And really that's what's going to drive growth in a meaningful way for sure.
And more importantly too, I always view that, when you're trying to court that candidate, that big partner that you want to bring over, what is their experience like? No one likes to go through an interview process that will last 3 months and has 20 meetings. And so the more that we can really help firms create that experience that's going to get a lateral excited to come to the firm, that's a very easy way to set yourself apart from the competition when you're really trying to get after that good talent.
Yeah. So what are some examples that you've seen of effective, hiring processes of attracting those laterals to your firm?
Yeah, I would say the first and foremost, doing your own recruiting. I think there's data out there with surveys, there's data out there with, there's data out there in terms of, onboarding and that sort of thing too, that indicate that lateral or potential lateral partners that you want to hire appreciate being contacted by the firm as opposed to a third party. And so what we've really tried to do is arm our firms, our clients, with data and with intelligence that allow them to approach those candidates with, with confidence and with a compelling message. And so I think that's front and center in terms of establishing competitive advantage. I think from when it comes to a process standpoint, a lot of firms don't have a centralized repository for a lot of this evaluation data. So when, a partner goes to have drinks with a potential candidate, that's not that conversation, and the intelligence that is, being generated from that conversation is not being captured anywhere. It's lost. First impressions, discussions about clients, discussions about type of practice, all of these are very relevant, and a lot of it falls through the cracks. And so what we've really tried to do is create a process that's standardized and scalable so that firms can really get a stranglehold on the type of information they need to make high quality decisions.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the unique things that we do when it comes to process is you really need to re-educate the attorneys that are doing the interviewing as well. And that you typically falls apart. People are running from matter to matter, and they run into a meeting. They're not prepared with what questions to ask and why they're asking it. And so if we can better coach, whether it's the talent team or the recruitment team, to be able to go in and really teach the lawyers why they're there and not waste their time, I think is something that holds us apart as well. But that firms just need to spend more time on it, and they just frankly don't have it.
Mm-hmm. And teaching lawyers new things is always the challenge, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. For sure. I mean, that's just not kind of in their wheelhouse. That's not one of their high priority skills. But what I will say too is the feedback that we hear from candidates as they move through a firm is they really do pay attention as to if they're being asked the same questions over again and again. It's quite frankly, again, I think from a candidate perspective, it feels like they're wasting their time, and it shows that the firm isn't organized or as collaborative as they're saying they are.
Another successful thing, and piggybacking off what Julie said, is, infusing operations professionals in the process. So having operations professionals in the meetings to take notes and to, ask some of the questions and to be active participants in the process also helps corral some of this information and, takes a lot of pressure off the partners in terms of prep time and that sort of thing. So essentially keeping people off track. And think about how hard that is when you have, 15 offices across the United States. You need somebody in every office where they have a designated role where, they are involved with the interviewing and the evaluation process that way. So it can be a very daunting task, but there's definitely solutions out there that can help a lot of firms with their hiring practices.
Yeah. And that makes sense too, to have some other business professionals as part of that process, because then they can share other things about what the firm does, how it operates, that perhaps the lawyers themselves aren't necessarily as keyed in on. So, that makes a lot of sense to start including those people as well.
Yeah, I will say I grew up in the client development world in law firms for 20 years, and I was always fascinated with them not having client development within those conversations, because we're the ones that are charged to grow business and grow client relationships. And you can find out very quickly if a candidate does have that book of business when they can't answer the questions that you're asking. So a big shout out to the marketing and business development teams out there that they absolutely need to be involved in these interviews if you really want to find out what they have to bring when it comes to client development.
Right. So I want to turn to something that you mentioned a little bit ago, Julie, of strategy and strategic growth. And what struck me related to that was again that bifurcation of partners versus associates. And obviously bringing in the partners who have those client books is a very key thing. But, in my mind, as far as growth for the future, a healthy emphasis should be placed on having associates and younger, newer attorneys to kind of fold into those partner roles as time goes on. So I know you mentioned the teams aspect of if the partners come, the associates will come. What other kind of perspectives have you seen in terms of emphasizing growth in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the big red flags that we see all the time is when a lateral comes over and they say they have like a $5 million book of business, and we say, okay, we'd love to hear what your team looks like, and they say, oh no, it's just me. That's a big indicator that they, one, either don't have that book of business that they say, or that they don't have the skills that it takes to be able to lead a team and to grow a team. And because you're exactly right, typically the attorneys that have that big book of business are very good at shepherding and growing their associates and giving them the opportunity to actually do really good work. And so you're able to create that pipeline of associate work. I think, when it comes to when firms need to plug in with associates, that's something where I think firms don't put a lot of time and effort into it, because yes, while they're supporting partners, they're really trying from a strategic perspective to ultimately grow their book of business and grow their bottom line revenues and their profits per partner. So what we've been really seeing when it comes to teams is that what type of clients do they have? One of the most fun work that we do is when we meet with a law firm, we really talk strategically about how they want to grow, whether it's by industry team, by market. And sometimes firms don't know, like they really don't know where they should start. And the easiest way to start, if you don't know, is where have you found success when it comes from a client perspective? And then we can go out in the market and look at other similar based clients or potential clients that you can go out and get. So we can identify the current partners that do that type of work and what firms that they are at. So then the firm has an opportunity to go and recruit those attorneys specifically based on the clients that they have. And that is definitely a newer trend that we're going to be seeing in 2025, but it's something that we found to be very effective and firms have been very successful at.
Yeah. And Julie, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think, we're in the midst of a seismic shift in terms of how law firms view growth. I think, 30 or 40 years ago, you hired associates and a certain percentage of those associates became partners and leaders at your firm. And now associates are largely viewed as fungible assets, right? You can switch them out. There's a move away from volume and some firms are focusing on quality. I don't think there's one strategy that firms are employing at the associate level to try to drive growth other than optimizing efficiency and trying to retain, the best talent within their associate classes. But outside of that, I think that there's a lot of ways to improve on that front. Succession planning has been a big deal for law firms for a while. And, it's very hard. I think a lot of firms are more comfortable with hopefully passing that torch internally as opposed to somebody who maybe just came to the firm in terms of a lateral hire.
Right. So then one of the last couple of things I wanted to talk about was, what makes a successful lateral hire? Like, how do you, once you go through the process of bringing somebody on board, and then, after a little bit of time, you say, boy, that really worked out. I'm glad we went for that partner or that associate. What does it look like when you make a successful hire?
Yeah, this is something that we've been trying to capture for a long time. And I think we've become pretty decent at identifying some of the indicators of success. Now, I want you to keep in mind that law firms have varying ways of measuring success. There are literally law firms that don't care, that need people to do the work, and they aren't really wrapped up in measuring success on either a dollars and cents or a cultural perspective. And the other kind of component to this is we have to move away from the idea of success being binary. There are degrees to success. It's very hard to, look at somebody in a vacuum and say, oh, this person is a great hire or a very bad hire, because oftentimes it's somewhere in the middle. The other point I would make about, before we go into a little bit of the indicators, are it depends on the expectations that are set at the outset of the hire. We have clients come to us and saying, look, we need service partners. We need people. We have a lot of overflow work in certain practice areas. We just need somebody to come in and be great in the room and have a high, legal acumen, legal skills acumen. And, that's it. And then we have other people saying, look, this person doesn't need a huge book, but we want the ability to potentially grow this person and cultivate some of the relationships that this person may have and grow their practice over a certain amount of years. And that's very different than analyzing somebody, that comes in and say, look, we need X amount of money from you or X amount of revenue from you. And so it is important to keep those expectations in mind before you analyze what constitutes a success. So anyway, we sort of break down success according to its component parts, each of which have sort of different ways to measure certain things. And the idea here is that we're trying to structure this to a point where law firms can actually apply some of these data points to start to measure whether or not people are successful and to what degree they succeed or need to improve. And one of those is business and client relationships, looking at the dollars and cents, the effective rate that they're charging, the billable hours, realization, those sort of things, at the end of the day are important to determining whether or not a lawyer is successful. What type of practice they have. This is something that, Julie and I have talked about for a long time. Sometimes the practice doesn't align with what the firm thinks they're getting. And that's a real big problem when it comes to trying to figure out what sort of platform is appropriate for growth on the, onboarding side. And if those don't align, then you're starting off from, a position from a weak position. Another component is cultural fit. We've talked about this a lot too. You got to align. You got to get along with your new team. You have to, be transparent. You have to share, because at the end of the day, being able to cross sell and being able to grow your book is paramount when you get into a new firm setting. And oftentimes, based on the data we have, is overwhelming percentage of partners move because they feel that their platform at their current firm is not doing their practice good enough. So they try to explore their options. And the last component is really profitability. So business and client relationships are one thing, but are you profitable? If you have a big team and you're spending a lot of money, you may bring in, $5 million, but if you're, losing money on a year-to-year basis, that's a problem too, or not bringing in business fast enough to cover your costs. So, those are a couple of different metrics. We have dozens that we measure success. We measure degrees of success for lateral hires, but, it is important that law firms need to at least think about some of these. And again, keep in mind, law firms are going to define success separately, and we allow sort of the law firms to build their own success model, when they're in the evaluation process.
But I do think that when we going back to process, like the success matrix should absolutely be a part of the process, because what we've seen and what I've seen throughout my career is that once the lateral comes on board, everyone is excited and they start to get to work, and then they never really take a look at all of those different aspects of how to evaluate them. And so typically it's 2 years down the road, and all of a sudden they really see that they're not bringing in that book that they said they were going to bring, and think all the money and investment time that firm has put into that candidate. And after 2 years, they decide to let them go. Whereas I think a lot of those things could have been like nipped in the bud within the first 6 months of bringing that lateral on. But I think firms kind of have the mindset of once they're there, let them do their thing, and then we'll touch base with them when it comes to like that 2-year benchmark. But I think that benchmark is starting to shrink significantly, which is good for firms, but not so great for laterals.
Yeah, definitely. And lastly, with the little bit of time we have left, I want to touch on an aspect that I'm sure plays a role in influencing all of those success metrics, and that is, the use of technology, the adoption of it, and all the kind of new functions that legal tech has nowadays, not the least of which is obviously AI. So in terms of, hiring, the lateral hiring process, the integration process, what have you been seeing on how technology is being used lately to help with that?
I think it's first extremely important to distinguish what AI is good at and what it's not good at currently. I think it's very good at automation. It's very good at, scaling up replicable processes and saving time on the talent side. So a lot of the process related stuff that we've talked about today could be, helped using AI. The problem is that you have to customize it. And the problem is that you have to have an interface that is usable. And that is where I think, AI specifically lacks the functionality currently. Now, I certainly, I certainly think that AI has, tremendous benefits, potential benefits in the future, but I really don't think it's to the point now where firms can integrate, off the shelf tools and help them on the talent side. What they can do, and Julie hit on this very appropriately earlier, is they can create a process that then they can layer on AI tools that can help with segments of that process until the technology has gotten to a point where they can overlay kind of a comprehensive system that enables a lot of functionality to be enabled, or to be used widespread by the firm and the professionals that need it. But I think that innovation is going to come from other sectors. I don't think it's going to come from the legal sector. I think that there's a little bit of a bubble in AI, and I know that's an unpopular opinion as, firms continue to invest in AI, but, the integration aspect is going to be the most important and critical aspect of AI. And as we talked about earlier, law firms are not the best at integrating new technology and new things. So I just think there needs to be an element of caution when we're talking about a lot of these tools influencing, the talent sphere specifically. Now, obviously the practice of law is a little different. There's definitely processes and functionality there now that can be leveraged by a lot of law firms, but just on the talent space, that's sort of my perspective on it.
And I also would say from a talent perspective, the amazing folks that we work with are typically completely stretched way too thin, and they have so much on their plate and they're balancing so much. And so obviously AI is a very exciting thing to consider, but people are so underwater that for them to be able to really dig into that and develop something on their own, I think we're not there yet. But where we are is that, firms can partner with folks, obviously like Decipher and others, that can help them with their processes so that they don't feel like they're as underwater as possible. So while I think AI absolutely has a place in the talent world, I don't think we're there yet.
Gotcha. But something to keep an eye on for sure. I'm sure it will eventually get there, but obviously a lot of work still to be done as firms continue to have that debate. So, well, thank you both very much for being here. It was a lot of great insights, and hopefully firms can take some advice on how to make sure their processes are working the best they can to bring that top talent in. So,
we really appreciate the opportunity. And if firms do have questions or would like to chat, like obviously feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, thanks to our viewers and subscribers for tuning in. Please be sure to give us a like on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, or you can also find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you can learn more about ALA at alanet.org. Until next time.